All right. Well, I welcome you this afternoon to a panel discussion and question and answer on behalf of the Stevenson Library. And my name is Jane Smith, and I'm the Associate Director of Library Writing Support. And despite my email of this afternoon, we are not able to see you right now. We will be able to see you later on, but we can't hear you or see you at this point. And we're here today to have a conversation about writing two tricky pieces of your senior project, the introduction and conclusion. And these are potentially powerful moments with important jobs to do, namely usher readers into and out of your project. In other words, they're intensely social sites where you need to be especially mindful of your readers. In fact, the intro and the conclusion may be the first parts or the only parts that some people read. Now, I'm not talking about your board. I'm sure they'll read the whole project, whatever your suspicions. But I'm talking about people who might find your project on Bard's Digital Commons, who just want to get to the gist of what your project is about. And today's event will have two parts. During the first half, our four panelists will offer you their best advice. And in the second half, they'll take your questions. And our discussion should last about an hour, possibly longer if you have a great many questions. And as questions occur to you, even while the panelists are speaking, you can type them into the chat box. And during the question and answer session, you can also click raise hand, and we'll try to get around to you. So let me introduce you to our panelists, and who've read more senior projects than you can shake a stick at, and who have plenty of experience writing introductions and conclusions to their own work. And because they represent three of the college's four academic divisions, they'll be able to talk about discipline-specific strategies for beginnings and conclusions. What might be appropriate for a project in economics might be wildly inappropriate for one in literature. However, some strategies transcend disciplines, and they'll be able to talk about those too. So we have from the Division of the Arts, we have Alex Kitnick. He's Assistant Professor of Art History and Visual Culture, the Brandt Foundation Fellow in Contemporary Arts, and a faculty member of the Center for Curatorial Studies. From the Division of Languages and Literature, we have Daniel Mendelsohn, who's the Charles Ranlett Flint Professor of Humanities. And next we have Jim Keller, Director of the Learning Commons, and he's also a visiting Associate Professor of Academic Writing and a Senior Faculty Associate of the Institute for Writing and Thinking. And finally, we have David Shein from the Division of Social Studies, who is Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs, Dean of Studies, and a Visiting Assistant Professor of Philosophy. So to start things off, each of our panelists will speak for 5 minutes. And I think we'll go in the same order that I introduced them in. So that means that Alex, you're up first.
Great. Can everybody hear me? You can hear me? Great. Thanks, Jane, for organizing this. And certainly, introduction and conclusion are very significant parts of the project. And since I'm at the top of the bill, I will say make a couple strong programmatic statements that my colleagues can either agree or disagree with. Despite it being called an introduction, I would make the argument that you should write the introduction last, that the introduction should be the last thing that you complete in your project. I think we write with keywords in mind, we write motivated by certain ideas, but I think writing is also an experimental process, and we don't always know where we're going to go, and we don't always know where we're going to end up. And I think writing the introduction is a kind of exciting moment to go back, to look at your work, to see what you've actually done, to see the ideas that you've actually generated, where your thinking has taken you. And it's an opportunity to kind of revisit the course of the project And in a sense, it's an opportunity for you to draw a map of the project, to draw a map of your thinking and your thoughts and where you went over the course of this year. So I think the introduction is also, you're kind of handing this map to your reader. You're giving them a guide to tell them where they're going to go, where you're going to lead them. I think it's also an opportunity, as Jane was saying, many people will read your projects in their entirety, but the introduction should have a hook. It should be strong and punchy. I think it should make some claims that, not necessarily provocative, but catch the attention. And I think this could even start in the first sentence. I think there's something important about writing a strong first sentence. You open up the project and something kind of hits you or grabs you, and you say, "Oh wow, I'm interested in where this text is going to take me." So if the introduction is a kind of map or guide, and it lays out certain kind of points ahead, for me, the conclusion is a place to kind of speculate on possible futures, right? The beginning of a conclusion might kind of quickly rehearse where we've been, just so, especially if it's a long project, you might have been read over the course of many days or even many weeks. And I think the conclusion should kind of very concisely summarize where you've been at the beginning. But I think the conclusion is also a place to kind of begin to speculate, to imagine, to suggest other places where this kind of very focused project might lead us, right? And I think I've also found it effective in conclusions to end on a kind of personal note, to end with a kind of reveal, to say, this is how I actually got into Dostoevsky. This is what actually interested me about the paintings of Leonora Carrington. I first saw them at this moment. Sometimes I think that these more personal chords are better struck in the conclusion than in the introduction. It's often kind of a nice reveal. It kind of humanizes the project at the end. So again, I mean, in real shorthand, I would say that the introduction is a kind of map. It's a kind of guide that you're offering to your reader, and you're inviting someone in to come with you, and that the conclusion is a place to speculate. And I would also say that because these are big tasks, that the introduction and the conclusion do bear a lot of weight, that they are difficult. And I think you'll find yourself, especially with an introduction perhaps, when you have to sit down and say, well, what was this all about? It can be a difficult moment. You've been working on this for so long, for this entire school year and maybe beforehand. So I think an introduction is also written dialogically. This might be an opportunity to call a friend, to Skype a friend, to Google Meet a friend or a parent or a caregiver or an intimate. And, when that person asks you, well, what was the project about? The answer that you might give them might be the beginning of an introduction. So I think that's about 5 minutes, and I'm curious to hear what my colleagues think about that. If they could hear me.
What?
If they could hear me. I don't know.
I'm assuming everyone can hear us. So what I'm about to say, I'm going to say not as a professor, but as a writer. My first piece of advice is that when you're writing a thesis, you have to think of yourself as a writer, right? You can't act as if you're talking to yourself. Remember that you're presenting your thesis to other people who are not as intimate with your subject as you are. And every writer knows that there's two parts of any piece, whether it's a 1,500-word article or a 150-page book. There's two places that unfortunately bear the most stress, and that's the beginning and the end. Specifically with respect to beginnings, I have an editor at the New Yorker who always says you have one sentence to get them interested, right? Because if you're not interested in the first sentence, you're probably not going to get to the second sentence. So how do you begin? One thing that Alex just said that I think I would like to build on is as you present your thesis to your reader in your introduction, try to remember yourself what got you interested in your topic to begin with, because that is likely to interest somebody else. It can be an anecdote about how you came to the topic. That's a tried and true and often very effective way. It can be an anecdote from your thesis about your topic. I always like to, but it needs to have, it needs to grab your reader. So think of something fun, something amusing, something quirky from your topic, something unusual, something that creates some traction. I always do the same thing when I do this introduction and conclusion spiel every year. And I like to contrast the beginnings of two biographies of the same person. So a few years ago, I was in the gift shop of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And as one does, I was looking for a biography of one of the mistresses of Louis XV, named Madame de Pompadour. And there were, as it happened, there were two biographies side by side on the bookshelf. So I took the first one down, and this is how it begins. This is a biography of an 18th century lady who was a mistress of the King of France. So here's the first book I took down. The exact origin and date of birth of the Marquise de Pompadour were totally unknown during her own lifetime. The first precise information we have was published in 1867 by a researcher who had consulted the Paris registers of this Church of Saint-Eustache in Paris before they disappeared during the Commune, blah, 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 blah. Okay, I'm already in a coma. Now here's book number 2 that I took down by a wonderful novelist who decided to write a biography of this same lady. And this is how her biography begins. After the death of the great king, beautiful Versailles, fatal for France, lay empty 7 years while fresh air blew through its golden rooms, blowing away the sorcery and bigotry which hung around the walls like a miasma, blowing away the old century and blowing in the new. Now, here's my question. Which one are you going to read, right? One has style, one is fun, one is just a recitation of facts and how they did their research. I would say go with number 2. So remember, you want to entice your reader. You want to think of a way of presenting something fun from your research up front as a way of drawing in the reader. And as I said, a good sort of a fallback is how you got interested, right? Or something fun from your subject, some counterintuitive thing, some weird story. That's always a good way to begin. Now, endings, I hate to tell you, I think are even harder. And one way, and I'm going to build on something Alex said, but I think what the ending should not be is a summary of everything you've said. A very good rule of thumb is to remember that the ending, the conclusion, your little, whatever it is, 5, 7 pages, 3, whatever it is not the climax of your argument. The climax of your argument or your thesis happens in your last chapter. The ending is like the cigarette afterwards where you're thinking, wow, that was great. Now let's think about what we just did, right? So the ending should be, as Alex said, it should be both summary, but it should also give some sense of the possibilities or the implications of what you've successfully argued in the actual thesis. So one rule of thumb, I always say, is pretend you had another chapter to write what might that chapter say if you had the time, space, energy, courage, whatever, to go on one more chapter? So it's like you're standing overlooking the landscape. You're not going to go there. You don't have time. You're never going to get there. But you might suggest to your reader where you might go if you could expand your thesis. So I think that's usually my advice for endings. Don't just summarize, because we know in a 60-page thesis what you've said, but sort of take what you've done and maybe look forward to where it might go if you had a little bit more time and space. So those are my, my basic recommendations for beginnings and endings. And you can ask questions later.
So Jim, are you ready to go next?
I'm ready to go next.
All right.
Excellent. Everyone can hear me, I'm guessing. So first, thanks to Jane and colleagues for pulling this panel together. Keep up the strong work, project writers. You're in the home stretch, and it's a very good sign that you're here on video with us. And I think I'll just continue building on insights that Alex and Daniel have shared. In fact, it's impressive how much without planning, it seems like we're kind of zeroing in on many of the same ideas. Concerning introductions and conclusions to your senior project, introductions and conclusions are the most social parts of any written communication. And it's social in a way, and I think Daniel said this, because the introduction invites readers into a conversation, and then the conclusion returns readers from the author's thinking within their field and responding to important questions within their discipline. And that's what your project is. The introduction will address a topic that will not try to establish unquestioned authority, right? Or solve some kind of problem necessarily, or introduce a previously unthought new cultural paradigm. You also don't want it to be a place where you're dumping a lot of data. And so just kind of following up on the thoughts that are already out there, the introduction isolates a specific issue and explains why it is relevant to the discipline. And I have an example, if people will bear with me for a minute. An example with permissions from a senior project. And let me know if you can't see this, but it looks like everyone can see this. This is an outtake from the conclusion to an introduction of a project that I and others read and were pretty taken with. And I'll just read it quickly. This project will consider Cassandra, the classical literary heroine, not any one specific writer's use of her, not any one delivery of her words, but whole, as she echoes back to us moments of the past and reflects for us moments that we cannot or have not escaped in our present. I also want to take seriously the moment the Classics is having in political and academic discussions about whether or not colleges should promote reading of ancient texts written, it is believed, for and by dead white men. The argument to let these texts recede into the past is that they are there simply to promote and preserve a history that has only selected certain voices and allowed all others to be dominated. Okay, now we'll come back to you. Did that work? Hallelujah. So anyway, if you'll notice, the writer there makes a number of very important moves. They introduce and refine a few key questions, right, that are still very relevant and open-ended. Questions like, well, what do we find when we consider this character, right? Why is the character Cassandra relevant to classics? Why in the present climate? What challenges does this character pose to conventional wisdom in that field, right? So something important seems to be at stake, right? A conversation needs to be had still, and we need new information. And this person is going to bring us some new information. You'll also notice maybe that these questions are the kind that invite sub-questions. That is, you could keep talking about this and you could even branch off into other conversations. So it's very generative. Um, and the author really is not trying to front load the entire project into that introduction, right? The author's asking, what am I looking for? Let's go look for it, not this is what I've found, and then just give you too much. They do a number of other things. They forecast their topic, and really kind of talk about exploration before judgment, right? The reader senses that the writer is going to allow time for an open-ended kind of exploration and investigation. And there's a sense that if you read this, the deeper you look, the more you'll see, right? And that's the kind of tone that I found in one paragraph in an introduction. There's another one, if I have time, that I'll get to very quickly, I promise. I'm moving on now to conclusions. Just a minute. Okay, and this is, like I said, from a different field, slightly different field, with both within languages and literatures. The premise of this project, all that I have said and tried to say is this, that language, however imperfect, lying and illusory, creates truth and is everything we have. Cling to words, even as they wax, wane, disappear entirely. Cling to words and delight in their transformations, their volatilities, their flightiness. Cling to words and know that they are not real, nor are they perfect, but also know that they are exactly what is needed in every moment. This project, which was a study of a modernist American poet, encapsulates a belief in poetry, a feeling of affection and of love that I have long shared but struggle to put into words. And I think this bears out something that Alex was saying, which is, or both actually panelists were saying, that this is where you get the personal investment, right? That moment where you learn why this project mattered personally to the writer. The conclusion is asking, where did this research get us? And it sort of restates, why does it matter that I ask these questions, right? So you see that again, it's implied in the introduction, it's more clear here. It's leaving the reader with the writer's most invested insights, but put into a broader perspective. And you can tell the writing is very personal and energetic. It even uses poetic device of repetition, while it remains very clear. And the author of the project really kind of reveals writing as social, right? Even though the project was fueled by a personal passion, the project was generated in conversations with the field of literary studies. So that's what you're looking for, a tone that can be set in the introduction and affirmed in the conclusion. You're giving the impression of a writer who remains in charge of your own investigation. There's a question that you undertook to explore. And that will let you feel like you've made it your own. Anyway, the last piece of advice I would give is read and revise other papers, read other papers, revise your own constantly. If you're writing your introduction, you might find that the first draft of your introduction has a conclusion that upon rethinking would have been better off at the beginning, right? So constant revision. It's a circular recursive process. And on the note of being social, be a friend to make a friend, share what you're writing with whoever will listen, however you can get them to listen, whenever you can get them to listen, and be nice and offer to go over their writing with them as well. And that's what I've got. How is that on time?
Hi, y'all. I think I'm going to say things that are very similar to things that Alex and Daniel and Jim have said. So the good news is that if all four of us are saying it, it must be true in some way or another. I'm going to change the metaphor a little bit. Not a conversation, not something that comes with a cigarette at the end, although I like that quite a lot, Daniel. I think of a senior project. The senior project is the last thing you're doing at Bard, and it is the end of your journey through college. You'll forgive the hackneyed metaphor. It's going to get more hackneyed, so bear with me. But as I think about you as the writer of a senior project, I think about you as taking your readers on a tour, on a journey, on an exploration of some area of study that you've discovered, that you've fallen in love with, whether it's literature or philosophy or a particular painter or whatever it is, right? Whatever the theory, the topic. And your job as the writer of that senior project is to be my tour guide as I'm your reader. And your introduction and your conclusion are doing particular things. So I think of this, and I do think of this, right? So the introduction, we haven't left yet for the journey. We haven't left yet for the exploration. We're in some hotel, and you're kind of like, you're prepping me. This is where we're gonna go. And so the introduction is giving me the broad overview. This is why I want to bring you to this place, right? And it's autobiographical. It's telling the reader about your investment in this particular topic. This is how I came to be interested in writing a senior project on T.S. Eliot or on Virgil or on this particular theory in philosophy or sociology, whatever it is. So it's describing the broad terrain, and then it's telling me the particular area in that terrain where we're going to go, right? So this first part, to vary this a little bit, is about you and your interest in the topic, and then you're switching gears and you're telling me what the topic is. Through moving from how you came to be interested to what it is, describing the particular part of the terrain that you're going to bring me to explore, right? So we're going very broad, we're getting narrower, and then great. So I love poetry. I fell in love with poetry in first year seminar, first discovered poetry, decided to moderate into this field. In moderation, I really found that it was this particular author, it was this particular text that I loved. And so now here I am writing a senior project on this text, and let me tell you what you're about to encounter, right? So now we're getting to the detail street level map. In chapter 1, we're going to go over X, blah, 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 blah. Here's the goal of chapter 1. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to go through the swamp. And then in chapter 2, once we've made it through the swamp, then we hit the mountain. I'm trying to remember the line from The Princess Bride with the rodents of unusual size. You know what I mean? And then we're going to get through the swamp, and we're going to get to this next thing. And then in chapter 3, we're going to get to this other area. And so you're giving me a roadmap. So the introduction is really laying out for me as your fellow traveler, telling me where we're going, broad stroke, telling me where we're going more particular, and then giving me a roadmap, handing me a map where we're going to go. And then the rest of the senior project is you're taking me on that tour, right? You've taken me by the hand, you're my tour guide, and we're going through the area. When we get to the conclusion, which is terribly named, Daniel, I like that fact that you talk about startings and endings and not conclusions, because a good conclusion doesn't actually conclude, it just ends the journey. And so continuing that metaphor, we made it through the journey. We're back at the hotel, we're in the bar, we're having drinks. Here we can have a cigarette. And we're sort of reflecting on where we went. And we're trading tales, right? And we're remembering the highlights of the journey we went on. We're talking about paths we didn't go down. I could have done this with the senior project. I chose not to explore this part of it for this reason. I chose not to explore these implications or connect it with this author, though I could have. And I'm pointing in the direction of, had we continued going, this is where we would have gone. Had you continue, so now if you take away the metaphor here, right, it's the conclusion is saying, not summarizing, but kind of giving a brief overview. Here's what I tried to do in this project. And having gotten to the end, I realized that I could have done some other things. I could have put Nietzsche in conversation with Dostoevsky, but I didn't, and here's why. I could have looked at this additional text. I chose not to. Here are the reasons why. And if I were to continue doing this, if I were to continue this work, I might want to go look at these areas, think about these things. This is where this study would lead me were I to go forward. So the introduction sets up the journey. The project is the journey. And the conclusion is sitting back in the bar trading stories about it, thinking about what we did, what we didn't do, what we wish we had done. The last thing I'm going to say is that nobody in the history of senior projects at Bard or anywhere else, nobody's ever written a really great senior project and a less good conclusion and had a senior project board say, wow, that was a really great senior project, but the conclusion sort of stunk, so we're going to mark it down. A good conclusion can do really great things for the senior project, but don't lose sleep over this. The introduction's super important. It sets it up really nicely. And the conclusion matters because it can allow you to end things as you want to end it. But the real work of the project, and I agree with Alex that the introduction should be written last. Though the autobiographical stuff is a nice way to take a break from your analysis. But Daniel said in a quick remark that the conclusion is 5-7 pages. Conclusions typically are shorter than introductions and certainly shorter than the main chapters of the senior project. And because they're really just reflections on what you've done, it's the doing that matters. A good introduction sets you up to help the reader understand what you've done. I'm going to stop talking and let people ask questions. I am going to ask, because I have to go help host a Seder, that if you've got questions for me, if you could ask them towards the beginning of this half hour, I'd appreciate it, because I'm going to sneak out soon. And I'm going to mute myself. And thank you.
Well, thanks to all 4 of you. I learned a lot. Just before we turn it over to student questions, I wanted to give you a chance if you wanted to follow up on anything or add to anything that anyone has said, disagree with anything. You don't have to say anything more, but if there's anything else that you'd like to address before we turn to student questions. Nope. Okay. All right. So it's time for questions. And it's also time for our wonderful AV folks working behind the scenes to make it possible for us to see and hear you. And for those of you who may have joined us a little late, you're welcome to type questions into the chat box. And both the panelists and I will be sifting through the questions and plucking out some to respond to. Or you can click on the raise hand button and if you click raise hand, we'll unmute you. So we're waiting for your questions. And the co-hosts, if you see any questions that you want to respond to, just go right ahead.
As you all are puzzling over the best ways to frame your questions, I know you've got a lot of them. Let me just remind you that you've been writing introductions and conclusions for lots of years. You're in your final semester of college. You've been writing papers for you've written lots of papers over the years. This is just the introduction to a longer paper. The senior project isn't substantively different than anything you've done. It's just bigger. And if you start getting psyched out about it, just think back to that great paper that you wrote for Daniel's philosophy research seminar or your junior seminar in literature, whatever it was.
We do have a question. How can one create a serious tone in the introduction but still grab the reader's attention? Daniel spoke on having a writer's mentality and use descriptive language, but if a topic requires a serious take, how do we start? So would anybody like to address that one?
I could try.
Great.
I don't think style and seriousness should be understood as kind of antithetical to one another, right? Style is seductive, but it's also serious, and it's a way of convincing someone that what you're thinking about is worth their time, right? So I wouldn't be afraid of style, I guess would be my first thought there. But of course, style is not the only way to get someone's attention, right? It might be the kind of a claim or something that, you know, a first sentence might say something like, you know, almost the opposite kind of of an idea that maybe many people hold, right? As a way of kind of almost catching the reader off guard, surprising them. Well, what could they mean? Then I'll have to read the second sentence, right? So there are all different kinds of way of getting people involved. I also find description of people describing a photograph, an image at the beginning, you know, it's a way of kind of guiding someone into your world. So there's all different ways of doing that. Some people are going to be more stylistically powerful than others, but I think there's all different ways to kind of excite your reader.
Yeah, I certainly did not mean to suggest that this is some kind of joke. My operating assumption is that all of your theses are serious about serious things, but that doesn't mean you can't have a little fun in terms of not just like the first of those biographies that I quoted, not just in some dreary way, you know, describing, you know, from the starting point, you know, the subject. You know, as I said, you back into your subject using some catchy or interesting moment from the research, from the text, whatever it is, and then you lay it out. You know, the introduction is just a way of, as it were, grabbing someone and saying, "Hey, look at this. This is very interesting." And now I'm going to tell you all about it. But it's the, "Hey, this is really interesting," that you have to accomplish in your introduction. That doesn't, it's not serious.
I would offer that I said very quickly before I spoke quickly, and I made a quick aside that while I agreed with Alex that the introduction should be written last, I think it's also a nice way to take a break, to give yourself a break from writing the other parts of your project. And I want to come back to that and emphasize that y'all are in different places with your project right now. Some of you can't wait to be done with it, right? You're fed up. You've been working on this thing and it's been a hard semester. Others, you're not ready to let it go yet. But every single one of you, when you sat down to start writing this project, was really excited about it. And you were a little or a lot in love with your topic. And your introduction is a way to get back to that love affair and to kind of rekindle that flame. And you can start with that. Start by telling us as your readers why you love this stuff, why you were so excited to write about it.
I also want to make one more point about this, which is that goes to something I think it was David who was saying before, that, you know, you've all written tons of introductions and conclusions. Let me add to that you have also all read tons of introductions and conclusions. I mean, you're all, think of every article that you've had to read, every piece of secondary literature, and see how they do it. I mean, you know, you read not just for the content, so to speak, of your secondary literature, but look at the secondary literature that you are using right now to write your thesis. How did those people start their articles and books? How did those people finish their articles and books? Those are all clues, and that's part of what your gleaning from reading other people's work is not just what they say, but how they say it. So you might want to, if you have a favorite source, a favorite secondary text, look at what they're doing.
I would ask, if I could just ask back to the questioner, you know, by serious is meant non-novelistic or non-personal. Those don't seem to be of as much moment as the question you're asking, right? That kind of passion can be felt. And the level of seriousness of your project will be shown by how detailed your question is, right, within that field. So I would locate seriousness there before locating it in tone necessarily. The tone will come, I think. Anyway, that's it.
All right.
I've got to sign off, y'all. I'm sorry.
Thank you so much, David.
Bye, bye, bye. You're all going to be great. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. So I don't see very many questions.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
You should all be able to unmute your microphones now. Sorry to interject.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I was just going, well, thank you, everybody, first of all. And I was just going to ask Professor Mendelsohn, you mentioned that the climax should come in the last chapter. And I was wondering exactly how you think one should, I mean, because I was thinking it would come in the conclusion, and I was just wondering how does one conceptualize or frame that part, that climax in the last chapter? I mean, am I overviewing, looking back at the first two chapters, or is there something intuitive about the climax itself?
Well, what I mean is that, you know, obviously you're all writing different kinds of theses in different divisions. I can't know what they are, and I only know about a certain kind of thesis. But presumably hopefully your thesis is an argument of some kind trying to prove a point. At this point, I'm going to assume that's the case. And if that is the case, I'm distinguishing the conclusion from the body of the thesis, right? So that the conclusion is not where you prove everything. The proving is in the body, everything that comes between the introduction and the conclusion. That's where you make your argument. By the end of your last chapter, your reader will have been convinced, hopefully, by your argument. The conclusion, all kidding aside, is a sort of both retrospective, like, okay, now that I've shown you that in fact The Simpsons is a far weightier and greater cultural achievement than Homer's Iliad, let's think about what possibilities that might lead us to, right? That's what I mean. The conclusion is, again, all kidding aside, is an aftermath. It's not the main event. If you haven't proved your argument by the time you get to the conclusion, your conclusion is not enough to do it. So think of the conclusion really as, you know, it's like everyone uses this term, the post-mortem, right? The party's over and the conclusion is where you get to talk about who had the best outfit and who you're not going to invite again and who you're You see what I mean? If you think of it that way, it's when in retrospect you weigh some of the implications of the actual thesis. Does that make sense? I think you should really think of the conclusion as detachable from the main argument. The paper can stand without a conclusion, but it's a lot better with a conclusion.
Thank you.
So, Katsiera, I don't think I'm pronouncing your name right, but do you have a question?
Jane, can I say one thing?
Oh yeah, go ahead, Alex.
Maybe as a kind of counter example to what Daniel's talking about with discussing the party after it's happened, you know, you don't want to be like your parents giving you a PowerPoint of their vacation, right? And then we did this, and then we did this, and then we did this, and you just can't wait to get out of the room, right? So not all recounting is pleasurable, but what are those kind of stories that are emblematic, or don't do the whole trip for us again. Give us, the moments in which something significant seemed to happen.
Right.
A
I mean,
minor.
I would say again, the conclusion is not a summary. It is not a summary. It has to add a little more to the equation.
There's another question. Is there any advice on how to balance communicating my personal interest in the topic and why it's important to me with the factual/scientific? How much is too much? I'm a psych major, but in the social studies division as opposed to science, mathematics, and computing. I also strayed away from using I while writing, but I'm finding it hard, especially in the intro and conclusion sections. Thoughts on this? Thank you so much. Would anybody like to respond?
Well, I think we just gave you permission to use the I in the conclusion and the introduction. I mean, I think balancing out everything that the four of us have said, you are allowed to be more personal in your introduction, and I would think even more so in your conclusion. That's where, I think it was David who said, those are the most social parts of your thesis. It's where you're most in communication with whoever is reading it and you're reaching out to them. So I personally have no problem with the first person in the introduction, in the conclusion, because that's part of what it's doing. I wouldn't do it throughout the whole paper, but I think, right, I would think that if there's no way to talk about how you got involved in the topic without using the pronoun I, let's put it that way, unless you're the Queen of England and you use we. But there's no way not to do it, and personally.
Yeah, I would just follow up. Both of those examples that I provided feature a strong use of the personal pronoun, right? Of somebody saying I. A number of people who are talking about why they were interested. So, I mean, there's another alternative to using the royal we, which is equally unattractive, which would be to just use this passive voice. One will note in the course of this study that death is a bummer, or whatever, whatever point you're going to get to, and it just rings false. So I don't think that a lot of students are really worried about that. I mean, you should talk to your project advisor to see maybe if you're overusing it, but the dread fear that a lot of students live in of using the I doesn't seem justified, or it looks like they're looking in the wrong place for something to be worried about. Right? I would be more fearful of an overly neutral tone.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. Does anybody who is unmuted want to ask a question? Let me just check the chat. Okay, I do see one. As a senior writing a proposal in psychology, tackling thesis statements of each paragraph, how do you keep it empirically sounding and not stray into the use of thesis statements to state my own argument beyond my main hypothesis? That one's a little hard to parse.
Does that person maybe want to speak up and explain what they mean?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Yeah, here she is. Clara, can you hear us? We can't hear you. I see that you're unmuted, but we can't hear you. Oh, she says her computer isn't working. It's been an issue for a while. So, yeah, I think without some further clarification, we're not going to be able to help you too much with your question. She's going to explain a little bit more in the chat. So while she's doing that, does anybody else have a question? You can use the raise hand button if you like. And I'll just say while we're waiting for, I think Clara is typing, I think that one thing that is important, and I think Jim touched on this, is that you need to have a question to ask in your introduction. This is an inquiry that you're embarking on, and it's a question to which we hope you didn't have the answer before you started on your exploration. So I think that stating that question is really important. And a lot of introductions don't do that. They just sort of say, I am analyzing XYZ because I want to. And we never know what the question was that provoked that analysis. So that's something that to keep in mind. And I think, okay, here's a question. Can you talk about deciding on a title for your senior project?
I'm terrible at titles, so I'm gonna pass.
I would just say throw a lot of stuff to the wall and see what sticks. Don't go with the first thing that you find. Maybe one of the more insightful moments, either a quote that you're very drawn to from a text that you're analyzing, or your own statement somewhere can come out and serve as the title if you think it really kind of has a comprehensive, offers an overview of the entire work. But I think the best advice might be throw a lot of these proposed titles out at friends, right? And see what people listen to and resonate with, right?
Also remember, the title doesn't need to say everything about the thesis. I think that's one useful thing to keep in mind. You don't have to, it doesn't have to do that much work.
I have some thoughts about titles.
Great, go ahead.
I would say, first of all, I mean, coming back to what Daniel was saying about his editor talking about the first sentence, the title is kind of the sentence before the first sentence, right? It's the hook before the hook. These are just two things I've been thinking about. I notice a lot of times in magazines these days, titles are often taken from other places in culture. So it's oftentimes a kind of song lyric or a line from a poem or the name of an album or the name of a movie, and they're repurposed to create a title. It's just a tendency I've noticed. I encourage people to keep an eye out for that when in their reading. And I'd be curious to know what people think to make their own decision. If they want to stay in that trend and topoi of kind of repackaging and rephrasing titles from the past, or trying to make a new title. It's very hard. Maybe that's why we do this. And also, if possible, and this is not always possible, but I wonder if it's feasible to challenge the academic convention of saying the first part of the title being something kind of broad, and then the colon, and then saying something specific. I think we should have a contest to see if people can abolish the colon.
We've got two more questions. The first is it okay to still not have an answer to your research question? Perhaps this is because I have a little more theoretical topic, but I still feel I do not have an answer.
I don't know, you know, it almost seems like it may be kind of a false lead to say, once I have an answer, I can close the project down and I'm done. I mean, it seems like you're asking the kind of question that opens up a whole lot of other questions that keeps the conversation moving in a direction that you've set the course for. I'm just trying to think, I mean, I don't assume that you're thinking there's an easy answer, but even any answer, I would just kind of go with the panelist who said, you know, think of the way you're ending the project as where would I go next? Or what question did that one open up for future research and discussion? Yeah, but then I think I'd like to hear more about what is meant by having answered the question. It just doesn't seem like it usually works that way.
Well, I mean, one thing, you know, always turn a problem into a solution. So if you've come to the end of your research, I don't know what field this particular questioner is in, and you haven't proved whatever it is you've set out to prove, I would make that the subject of my conclusion. You know, that becomes the subject of your conclusion, where, you know, I wanted to prove that The Simpsons is better than Homer, and I've made these arguments. You know, make something out of your problems. The point of a 60-page paper is not to cure cancer, save the world, or whatever. You're only going to get a little bit done. And so turn that into an advantage. You know, a good writer can always turn a failure into a success by talking about why the failure happened. I don't mean failure in that sense, but if you feel you didn't quite prove what you wanted to prove, talk about that. Speculate about why that happened. That would be, for me, one of the most interesting conclusions I've ever read in a thesis. You know, you don't, success in the thesis is just to have tackled the subject and wrestled with it. That's all you need to do in a serious way. So I personally would, look, I once wrote a book about a search for information about my ancestors during World War II. And there was a long time where I didn't find the information I was looking for. And I thought, okay, I'm just going to conclude by saying how I wanted to find this information, and it was impossible. That's a conclusion. A conclusion is not equal to winning the lottery. It's just summing up what you've done and thinking about it.
And we have another question. How much time should you set aside to write your introduction and conclusion?
Well, at least 10 minutes, I would say.
How many times do you want to, or do you plan to write and rewrite your introduction and conclusion? Because this really should be an ongoing, again, involving a lot of conversation with friends and advisors and whatnot. So I don't think, we're probably thinking of it the wrong way if you're sitting there with a stopwatch and saying, okay, I've got 2 days to go. That it should be something that you're developing, having started by now, and you can just continue thinking through. Right? And it's recursive insofar as you look at your project and then you see something you hadn't seen before, include that in the introduction. So it really should be kind of not thought of as start now and end here, but think about the introduction and conclusion as huge blocks of ideas that for a while you should be playing with, moving around. And that's what distinguishes novice from expert writers, right? Is the idea that you can take entire chunks of thought and move them around. So if you wait until it's too late to start that process, you won't have the free play and the freedom to just kind of luxuriate in your ideas and see where they belong. So start now.
All right, well, I think that our time is about up. So I'm going to give our panelists a moment to leave you with a last bit of wisdom and encouragement. So if the panelists would just say one last thing to the seniors.
I'll just jump on Jim's thought and start today and be in touch, whether it's with your advisor, your friends who are your colleagues, your family. Be open and get going.
On that note, I'll just end with something that's less wisdom than just information, and a shameless plug for the Learning Commons. We have 25 senior projects working with tutors now online, and you have about a month to go. We can accommodate a small number of senior project writers who would like to work one-on-one for about 1 hour per week, revising small parts of text. So we're at BLC at bard.edu, and be in contact with us sooner rather than later if you're interested in working with a tutor. That's the social element I was talking about, right? That's the element of bouncing ideas off of someone else rather than holding up in a garret, waiting for the muse to speak. Try your ideas out often and with many people.
Thank you.
I would just build on those two things and say two things. I would say if most people who do this for a living save their introductions and conclusions for last, I would write my introduction before I write my conclusion. And I think, only you know, there are no hard and fast rules because only you know how you function as a worker and a writer. If you're a fast writer, that's one thing. If it takes you a long time to write, only you know. So there's not a recipe that says, oh, a conclusion takes 6 hours and an introduction takes 2 days. But you have to just look at your calendar, figure out roughly where you are and how much time you have left. Give yourself a couple of days. The introduction and the conclusion, obviously, based on what we've said by now, all of us, are in their own ways retrospective. So you want to feel full of your thesis when you sit down to write your introduction and your conclusion. And the other thing I want to build on something Alex said is, be in touch. The point is not to surprise us with genius. We will help you to get where you need to go. This is not like a surprise birthday party. So if you're having problems, if this remains obscure, your advisor, any of us, I'm sure, would be happy to field questions, specific things. That's what we're here for. And better to reach out rather than find yourself with 12 hours to go, having no idea really what to do. So keep the communications open, and then we can help you.
Great. Well, panelists, I want to thank you very much for your insights. I think this was really helpful. And I want to thank all of the seniors for tuning in. And I want to wish you the very best of luck with your projects. And I want you to take care, and I want you to stay healthy. So good luck and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Stay the fuck home.
Thank you so much. This was incredibly helpful.
Oh, I'm so glad. So glad. Thank you for attending.
Yes, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Why doesn't Michelle here today?
Well, she was worried about Zoom and it not being very secure because there have been a lot of hacking of Zoom meetings. But because we have a Bard institutional account, the security is heightened. So I think she was maybe worrying a little bit too much, but that's why.
Okay. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you, Waylon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Cheyenne.
And sorry for the cat popping up.
Oh, that was lovely.
Clara, it's Paul from AV. You can give me a thumbs up if you're dealing with Carabelle now, trying to sort out your mic. Thank you.
Well, I think I'm going to stop the recording. I can.